This is Genes Within Populations, Chapter 20. I'll also be calling it the Evolution chapter. We will not be doing all the slides in this lecture. We'll be splitting up into 3 different smaller lectures. When Darwin published his theory of evolution in his book called Origin of the Species, he was not the first scientist to try to explain how living things had become so varied. He, however, was the first one who attached the idea of genetics, change over time, and the living things that you see every day, that variation, into one big evolutionary theory. His biggest competitor was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck's theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics had quite a following. He said that it had nothing to do with genetics, that evolution, or the change in variety of species, came from the characteristics that you created over time. So what he said was that whatever you do to your body over time, you can pass that on to your kids. So for his example, he used giraffes. He said the original giraffe had a normal short neck. It ate the leaves from the lower part of the trees. When it needed food higher up, it would just stretch its neck. And that stretch stayed and was passed on to their children. Those offspring then stretched a little bit farther, their necks got a little bit longer, and they passed that on as well, until eventually you end up with the modern day giraffe. If you apply that to humans, if you joined the track team and practiced and got faster and faster and continued all throughout your adult life to run and to continue to improve your speed, all those things that you do, the increased muscle strength, the better breathing techniques, you would pass those on to your children, and so they would be able to run faster than the children of people who had not done the track all their lives. Darwin said that it's not what you do with your body every day, but it's your genes that determine what your offspring look like. He called that descent with modification, meaning that your offspring came due to the modification of your genes over time. Keep in mind as we talk about evolution that you are not always creating a more complex organism. You're creating one that is a better fit to its environment. And if that means becoming less complex, then that's what will happen. We've talked a little bit about evolution in previous classes, but we're going to talk about the progress right now. First, it starts with a gene. We've talked a lot about genes, genes being a combination of those nitrogen bases, A's, T's, C's, and G's. If there is a change in that gene, you have a mutation. Mutations are not good or bad by themselves. It's the trait that they create. If the trait is non-beneficial, if it doesn't help the organism, that trait will disappear. If it does benefit the organism, makes them stronger or healthier, then that organism will become more successful. They'll get more food, they'll be healthier, they'll have more mates, and so on. That means that they then will create more offspring, and their offspring will have the new trait. Those offspring will also be more successful, so they in turn will have more offspring, and that trait will become more and more abundant in the population, and those organisms that don't have the trait will make fewer and fewer babies until the opposing traits disappear. That is called natural selection, because nature has selected that trait to survive. Over time, that trait will be the one that you see, and the population will have changed. It will have adapted to its environment, and that is microevolution. This change is small enough that these new organisms can still mate with and create offspring from the old organism. If the change is big enough that the new organism can't mate with the old one, then you have macroevolution, which is the creation of a new species. Now, in order for you to have natural selection that results in evolution, three things must happen. One, variation must exist among your individuals, meaning that you can't have the same exact gene. You have to have different alleles, different mutations. Number two, those variations must cause a difference in the number of surviving offspring. In other words, if you have that new variation, then you have to have more successful babies than anybody else. And number three, that variation must be able to be genetically inherited, meaning you have to be able to pass it on to your kids. If you can't pass it on, then it dies with you. If you have all three of those things, then you can have natural selection and you can have evolution. Genetic variation is the key. Okay? You have to have variation in order for natural selection to happen. That's in an individual. A lot of times we're going to talk about it in terms of population genetics because the entire population is what evolves. It's not the individual that evolves because it has to happen over generations. So what you're going to do is you're going to study all the genes in a population, see how all the genes interact, and see how all the genes make your population a better fit, make them survive better. I can't stress enough to you guys that natural selection and evolution are not the same thing. Natural selection is the process, the force that makes evolution happen. So evolution is the result. Okay, and I've got a couple examples. The one on the left is pocket mice. Originally there was one population of pocket mice and they were tan. Those that lived in the sand, the light tan, fit beautifully and predators didn't see them, they survived. Eventually some of those mice moved to nearby rocks. It was a lava formation, so it was black. Those mice that were lighter were seen by the predators and were eaten. Those that were slightly darker were able to hide and the predators missed them. Over time they got darker and darker and darker. Microevolution occurs. You have two populations, one that are tan, where they live in the sand, one that are black, that live on the rocks. On the right is a man-made example. These are the peppered moths. The picture at the top, the little bug at the top, white with the black spots, that's the normal color of the peppered moth. When the Industrial Revolution began, these guys live in England. There was a lot of coal ash in the air. The ash landed on the tree trunks and turned the trunks black. As the trees got darker, the white moths stuck out more and more and more. More predators found them. For those that had the mutation for darker wings, they were able to hide. So over time, the white moths disappeared and the black moths took over. Again, you had a version of microevolution. You've heard me talk several times about the idea of fitness. The official definition of fitness is one that produces the greatest number of surviving offspring. So the more fit you are, the more surviving offspring you create. And that's simply because you're better able to use the resources where you live. To be the most fit, you have these three components. First, you have an improved survival rate. You're able to find food faster, better. You're able to hide from predators better, so you survive better. Second, you have an improved sexual selection rate, meaning that you are chosen more often to be a mate, so you pass your offspring the new genes. And then third, the number of offspring, means you have a greater number of offspring per mating. So again, you leave your genes to more babies. It's all about leaving your genes to your kids. The last little bit we're going to talk about are the processes of evolutionary change. There are 4. First, we've talked about mutation already. That is the ultimate source of genetic variation. It is what makes evolution possible. However, a typical gene will mutate only once every 100,000 times. So because of that, genes, the allele frequency is pretty low compared to the other processes that we'll talk about. Gene flow, the definition is the movement of alleles from one population to another. What that means is immigration and emigration. Genes are brought into a population when a new organism arrives. Genes are brought out of an organism or out of a population when an organism leaves. Non-random mating is simply chosen mate, sexual selection in a sense. If you're a plant, that would be non-random mating, would be self-fertilization, meaning the pollen just drops from one flower to another. If you're talking about an animal, that's where the female chooses her mate because he's stronger, because he's got prettier feathers, for whatever reason, but she chooses him for a specific purpose. And then you have genetic drift. Genetic drift is catastrophe, things that happen that the population can't prevent. Flooding, disease, hunting, anything that will make a big impact on the population, and it's not anything that the individuals chose on their own. In my picture, say for example, the yellow birds are chosen by the environment to be susceptible to disease, and so they all die out, and then you end up with just the red birds. If your population is small, then genetic drift can have a very strong impact because you don't have very many individuals to start with. If your population is very, very large, then genetic drift may not be as detrimental to your population. In this case, there aren't a more fit set of genes. These are just happen to be the lucky genes, the birds that just happen to be in the right place at the right time, for example, on my slide. Genetic drift can cause big losses of variation within the population. So as we're looking at the last little bit, natural selection, the general mutation, gene to mutation to beneficial trait and so on, can be altered through these 3 things. You can have a favored allele get mutated again and go from being beneficial to non-beneficial. You can have a beneficial gene leave the population because of emigration, and so again the population instead of evolving stops. And then again you can have genetic drift. A favored allele is randomly wiped out due to an environmental catastrophe. All those things can slow down natural selection, or they can also speed it up if you do everything in reverse. That is the end of the first part, Fundamentals of Evolution. We'll continue on in our next section called Evolution and Processes that Modify it.